everyone. Welcome to another Friday in lockdown. I seem to be always coming to you on Fridays where the weather is spectacular, which is great, I suppose. We're allowed to have picnics now in Sydney, so everyone pack your picnic blankets and pack your picnics and get out there because it's another awesome weekend. I can see a couple of people joining us, so if you're jumping on and you want to say hi, just leave a comment. I'm super excited today. We are going to be talking about teenagers and are they more fragile? And, you know, or do they just need to suck it up a bit, really? Are we just becoming a bit over analytical maybe on emotions with our kids? Or do they really have it harder? Maybe teenagers have it harder these days than, I don't know, the war generation. That's what I don't know. So join us and say hi, tell me that you're here, and chuck a comment in there, and we'll get started. I'm super excited to have our guest on today. He's a great friend and colleague of mine, Dr. Tanveer Ahmed. He works as a psychiatrist in private practice. You may have also seen him as a commentator on Sky News. He does some writing. I'm going to bring him in because he's going to tell you about all the things that he does. I'll probably forget some of them. Here he is. Hi, Tanveer. How you going?
Great to be with you, Claire. And I guess a shout out to the parents. The first day of school holidays too, in lockdowns, but so the picnics are very welcome, I think.
I know. I was kind of I don't know. Look, teachers are thrilled at school holidays. They've done a fabulous job, some of them, in the creativity of the engagement of these kids. They're exhausted. So, look, they need the break. Parents this week to me have kind of said, oh, my gosh, like, yeah, homeschooling's hard, but now I've got 2 weeks of, like, nothing. So, I don't know. I think there's mixed emotions about these school holidays, yeah?
I think lockdown has the whole COVID thing has shown us that a good portion of what we call school is really childcare, isn't it? Like at least a good portion of it is childcare. And
yeah, absolutely.
During lockdown.
Yeah, and that's why like they can get all their schoolwork done by 11, and parents are like, how do teachers stretch this out till 3 o'clock every day? Because there's all that like in between stuff that happens, right? Yeah. All right, cool. So I'm going to be talking today. I can't wait for this. Actually, I'm really interested in some of your opinions. Tanveer's written a great book. I've got it here. Here we go. Look, Fragile Nation. I love the title of that. It's excellent. Fragile Nation. And I particularly want to chat about those issues to do with our kids. What a great time to talk about them. So I guess actually before we get started, I always like to start off with a couple of icebreakers. Can I shoot some questions at you first so we get to know you?
Sure.
Okay, cool. So my first question is, what did Dr. Ahmed want to be growing up? Did you always want to do psychiatry? When you were 8 years old, what did you want to do?
No, I don't think so. No, I don't think I was terribly. I don't think I would have known what psychiatry one even was. I think I just had the typical ones you have as a child. I think like a fireman, astronaut type sort of thing. I was very into horror movies as a 10, 11-year-old. And there was a period I thought not so much. I did get quite interested in how you come up with the costumes, like all the gear. So I remember there was a period of at least a year or two. That was a real hobby of mine. So that was probably a failed career trajectory of mine. Although I probably would have got replaced by digital anyway. So it's probably a good option.
Yeah. Awesome. All right. And what are you either watching, listening to, or reading at the moment?
Well, look, I think we're watching almost everything possible on streaming like everybody else. So I'm so hungry for new stuff. In fact, last night I watched an amazing show, which I'd recommend to all. I think it was the can't remember the name, Cardoggle Hotel. It's a film from a few years ago, but it's on Amazon now. And it looks at these 2 Finnish girls who work at a pub, Outback pub. And It's a real fly-on-the-wall documentary. And geez, it was good. It was excellent. Slightly disturbing in terms of how it exposes, I guess, some of the people in this town. But gee, I'd highly recommend it. In terms of reading, I'm actually reading a good friend of mine wrote a book recently on Afterpay, the company. Now, I'm not really, I wouldn't say I'm big on business literature as such, but I do write. I'm into this weird position where I'm a psychiatrist who writes a column for the Financial Review.
How did that happen?
But even though I get to write about social issues, they certainly write, they'd like me to try and link in, say, the workplace or business in some form. So I do sort of make an effort to sort of reach out and try and read that sort of scene a little bit more than I possibly would. But I think I'm finding that quite good. It's forcing me to read stuff that I wouldn't probably otherwise go for.
Oh, what a huge thing Afterpay is. Oh my gosh, I love it. I live by Afterpay. Anyway, and finally, what is the first thing you want to do when we have no lockdown restrictions?
Oh, God. Well, to be honest, I'm a big swimmer. Not that I'm a very good swimmer. In fact, throughout much of my primary school, I could barely swim after we migrated to Australia. But since I had a neck injury, that's actually, it's a bit of an old man's kind of exercise in a way. So I love swimming. And to be honest, probably one of the first things I will do will go to Drummoyne Pool where we live. And that's what I'm really hanging for. So that can't happen fast enough.
Yeah, excellent. Cool. All right, so let's get on to chatting about our teenagers at the moment. So obviously as a child psychologist here, a huge bulk of our work is teenagers, which, are just overrun at the moment with people needing to see us. But really, I mean, I'm talking not just in COVID times, but in the last few years. One of the things that you said in your book, which I just resonated with me so much, was that I'm seeing the special provisions in schools are so common these days that I've got kids telling me there are more kids in the special provisions room than there are in the main hall. And, and so just that concept of diagnosis rates and everyone having an issue and how that feeds into teenagers. Obviously, if mental illness, anxiety, ADHD or diagnosis become the norm, I think you said, well, the term illness is a little bit arbitrary, right? It doesn't really make sense anymore. And that has been on my mind now for a number of years. And so obviously that's is that what you see clinically?
Look, absolutely. And there's a bit of a class dimension to this, Claire, as well. So, the school Skeggs Darlinghurst in Sydney, which is, arguably the most privileged girls' school in the country, they had something like a rate of almost like a quarter of the year or something ridiculous was on special provisions a few years ago. And look, some of those not all of that is psychological, some of it's physical health stuff. But it is getting really out of control. And there is a bit of a inequality because not everyone can access, see the psychologist or psychiatrist and in regional areas, the regional or outer metropolitan areas, they may not necessarily get that access. But yeah, it's increasingly almost becoming a norm, an element of anxiety or any type of, it's almost become, I guess all parents think their children are special or amazing and we should to an extent we should, but it's almost becoming unacceptable that someone underperforms. So it's like we've medicalized underperformance now. So you can't just be an underperformer. You've either got an anxiety disorder or ADHD or that kind of stuff. And so I do think admittedly the education department is getting stricter, but I do think the inflation of diagnoses in Western societies is out of control. It really is.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes we see teenagers who come in here. I don't know if you see the same thing. And I've got a colleague who I supervise, and they come to me and they say, I'm not really sure what they're here for. I mean, there's kind of these generalized complaints, and I find it a bit hard to focus sometimes, and sometimes I don't feel very happy, and it's very generalized, and there doesn't seem to be any clinical symptoms of anything. And yeah, I mean, what about the medicalization just of emotion as well? I mean, of the tolerance of negative emotion, does that feed into that as well?
Well, look, if you look at the average GP now, Claire, like say in the past decade or so, when they've looked at this statistically, almost a third of the presentations they get will have some overlaps of mental health. But a good portion of that is really sort of problems of living. It's just day-to-day, a bit of strain on a relationship, or there's a bit of pressure, financial pressure, job pressures. So they're all kind of day-to-day problems of living much of the time. But now for them to get any sort of attention, they need a label. So part of this is sort of bureaucratic and how the system treats things and how we have to measure things. And I think even GPs and psychologists will know that a lot of the things they see are just ordinary kind of stressors that people have. But then to give them legitimacy, I think that's part of the thing. For these days, if our distress is not given some sort of label, it almost lacks legitimacy. We have to medicalize it. And I think we even see that in the pandemic. So mental health sort of become a bit of a political football in the pandemic. It's not enough that you lose your job or you can't go outside or you don't have liberty, but you have to say, well, there's a mental health dimension, there's a diagnosis. And obviously that's important. I'm not denying that that's a critical element here, but I think that's a marker that it's like not accepting some of these troubles that, the considerable troubles that many people are having, unless we give it a strong medicalization. And that's when people might sit up and take notice. They're like, oh, okay.
Yes.
So I think that's part of it. And where to give it, and I often, even today, Claire, every Friday morning I do workplace assessments, where it's sort of insurance claims, people, saying I did this, I didn't get this, or I got bullied, or this happened, I got overworked. And it's interesting to see that trend over the past decade. Like I've been a specialist for just over a decade, and you talk to senior colleagues, and they talk about how there's just been a boom in these types of claims. And a lot of it is what previously would have been industrial. So it would have previously been, okay, I go to the union, or I go to some Fair Work Commission because I'm not getting my hours, etc. But increasingly now, it comes through this mental health angle. They're like, and that gives it more legitimacy. They're like, well, hey, you did this to me. You didn't give me the right hours. Now I'm depressed.
Well, I've got a mental health problem.
Yeah. So and that's your fault. And without that mental health problem, it's like the mistreatment doesn't get the same authority.
But what does that do to, if you take, the typical teenager who may or may not meet, clinical criteria for depression, but, is feeling down, and maybe at the moment, right, in today's climate, is feeling pretty despondent and pretty hopeless and helpless, and they come along because they're just a bit flat and they can't get going. By labeling that, you have depression, you have an anxiety disorder. Does that help or hinder? Do you think, because in some kids I find that the helplessness kind of, oh, well, this is kind of a disorder I've got, and it kind of takes away from their own ability to help themselves. Does that make sense? Do you see that?
It's a tough balance. Look, I think the logic of this, Claire, historically, a lot of it comes really from addiction theory in a way where we almost consciously have medicalized some social problems. And the theory of it is that by medicalize it, we encourage help. So people then gives it that legitimacy, gives it direction, it gives a kind of, gives this sort of intention. People are, okay, right, I've got something, and bang. And you can also, give funding around it, and it destigmatizes it to an extent too. It takes out a moral dimension, etc., which isn't always valuable, I would say. But you're right. Sometimes that reduces agency for some people, and there's no question, you only have to look at the papers that the court reports. Every other person is claiming a mental health angle for a whole set of crimes. But it's definitely very powerful for kids, but they vary. It's interesting to see how different diagnoses vary. And you alluded to things like attention, etc. You get the feeling people like diagnoses like ADHD, attention, because, I don't know, it just seems to lack stigma, and it seems very functional related. Whereas they less like things like anxiety disorders or personality disorders. They don't necessarily like those diagnoses. And I have learned to be very careful, because you or I, when we do use these labels, and we might be flippant about them occasionally, but people latch onto them. It means a lot. And they'll come back to you years later and go, you told me, you said borderline personality or something like this. So look, for much of the time, I think it has its usefulness. But I do think we're often medicalizing things, that are behavioural or they're. One thing, I think a critical thing we should say for kids, look, the pandemic, there's no question there are statistical markers that there's something going on in this segment. Like we're seeing big increases in things like self-harm and eating disorders in particular, especially in the last sort of 10, 15 years. And that's across the Western world. It was interesting how it was highlighted through the pandemic, where there have been a significant increase in self-harm presentations, both in Victoria last year and this year in New South Wales. And we know the pandemic sort of has sped up all sorts of trends that were already happening. So whether the rush to digital is the most obvious one, but self-harm has also increased. And actually the chief psychiatrist in New South Wales did allude to that. And he did sort of casually mention that we know self-harm's been on the increase for much longer, more a decade. And this is actually quite a profound statement, but it's not something that journalists, et cetera, necessarily would have kind of seen the significance of. So I think we should clearly state that statistically, there is something going on in this segment. And we can never really, I don't think we can ever blame kids and teenagers because they're going to be canaries in the mine. So whatever's happening there will be a reflection of whatever we're doing or whatever the rest of us are doing, whether it's in families and communities, etc. I mean, you're right, there's a bigger emotionalism. One of the big trends is this generation. Now, they do seem to have a much bigger focus on emotionalism and emotional safety and being very wary of psychological harm. So these are really, really kind of fairly historical and quite profound trends that we've seen in the last few decades.
And I think, like, sometimes I just wonder whether in certain aspects have we gone too far with that. I mean, that teachers often complain that a lot of their curriculum time is used up with the teaching of these, emotional resiliency kind of catch terms. And one of the things that you chatted about in your book that I like too was the popularization of kind of positive psychology. And that's so true. And, that we should all kind of feel good all the time. And if we're not feeling good, then, what's wrong with us? We see that on, pervading through social media and the TikToks and the Instagrams and all that stuff. And then sometimes I feel like it swings the other way and there's this kind of great normalization of, everyone's depressed, it's okay. Like it's, sometimes I'm talking to teenage girls.
On one level, you have to sort of proclaim your pain and victimhood, and that potentially offers a degree of status. But we do have this cultural thing of positivity. And look, and part of my interest in that, Claire, we talked a bit about self-harm, and for those, for lay people, it's quite threatening, the notion of self-harm. But when you see people who self-harm, what they really talk about is this inability to tolerate negative emotion. And by negative emotion, we mean things like guilt, aggression, shame, disgust. And I guess I find that very interesting because that does seem to overlap with this cultural trend of positivity where we prize and elevate outward positivity so much that I wonder if a backdrop of that is this intolerability of what are normal, human, primitive, but what might get classed as more negative emotions. And you do wonder if kids are reflecting that. And you alluded to teachers, and you're right. And where well-being and psychological health has become such a big part of a teacher's and school's staple. And to be honest, I know in the past I thought, they're overreacting, but I can see how they've almost been forced upon it because so much of what they're dealing with at a day-to-day level, and often the things detracting from being able to teach kids seem to have such a strong behavioural or psychological dimension that it's become almost unavoidable. So I have sympathy for them then, but I think the challenge for schools is not to almost magnify this emotionalism, this whole generation where they're almost just too overly invested in the significance of their feelings. And the challenge is to kind of moderate moderate that trend. But you do worry sometimes schools may in fact magnify it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's, I mean, you know, I kind of sometimes feel like I'm part of that industry almost. It's like
we're part of that therapeutic complex, aren't we, Claire? Yeah, you're right. And I sometimes see that in my colleagues, and I think, well, part of me wonders if we have to be careful that we're not part of the problem.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I mean, in terms of destigmatizing mental health, I don't think you or I'd sit here and ever say that that's, you know, a bad thing. And the normalization of getting help, fantastic. The normalization of expressing emotions and telling people that things aren't okay, and initiatives like Are You Okay Day, great, fantastic, love all that. But I don't think we should be normalizing poor mental health in itself, because I mean, isn't that the same as, I mean, imagine if we were normalizing poor physical health. It's all normal to be kind of, you know, diabetic and all. Yeah, don't worry about it. Everyone's like that, you know. That people would find that very uncomfortable. We shouldn't be normalizing poor physical health. We shouldn't be normalizing poor mental health, but we should be normalizing the fact that if you do have a problem, come and get help, right?
Look, I think one of the issues, Claire, that I'm very concerned about here, part of the reason we have so much discussion about mental health is that we increasingly lack a language to describe our experience in other kind of categories. Like, we don't have much of a moral language. We no longer have much of, say, a metaphysical or spiritual language. So because all these other ways of describing our experience are on the wane, so suddenly then any sort of adversity or big questions, just transition periods in our life.
Are you specifically referring to decline in identification with religion there? Is that what you mean?
Well, I think that's one of them, not just that. But I mean, even, you know, people using like the language of, say, just of literature or something, or whatever it might be, you know, where you go through a difficult experience or suffering or anything like that. It's I think increasingly, because people don't speak about their experience in those terms, we're left only with the language of psychology. And I think that's part of and they've done studies even in like university students where they've tried to give them sort of ethical dilemmas or moral dilemmas, and they found that increasingly millennials and more recent generations, they almost don't have a template or a language to kind of weigh these sort of things up. So I think all we're left with, so it's like we're colonizing more and more of how people can talk about themselves, this language of mental health. And you were alluding to, you know, we were talking earlier that to an extent it's useful, you know, helps people get help. But after a certain stage, I think it really diminishes our capacity. And it also, it just diminishes, it's almost a less richer life if we have such a limited language to describe it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, so we've got parents watching at the moment who have teenagers at home who they don't really know what they're being exposed to on social media and you know, scrolling Instagram and TikTok and Snapchatting. And then I suppose they're heading to school and they're doing most of their mental health education through teachers. I still think there's a lack of kind of maybe conversations about it at home. And then they get their 15, 14-year-old child coming to them almost kind of self-diagnosing that they're depressed and they need to go see a psychologist. I mean, obviously, we can't diminish those feelings and we need to take them seriously. And I think if a child ever asks to talk to someone, I mean, I think you should do it because it's coming from a child. But I mean, do you have any ideas of how parents can best support teenagers where I think a lot of my parents I see think, is this for real? Because our life's pretty good. Like, really? Are you really depressed? Or is this because like 5 out of 6 of your friends are seeing a psychologist? No, you want to see a psychologist. So I get parents coming to me going, I don't know about this. Are we just feeding this? Should they go and see someone? Should they not? What should parents do?
Look, I think any chance that if a kid approaches you and makes that, I mean, that's really positive because they're actually trying to form a connection and they see the parent as part of the solution. So that's very positive because many teenagers aren't able to even do that. Look, I do think there's something quite serious going on here, Claire, and it seems to be more, especially for teen girls. So there is something about technology and social media that is magnifying the teen vulnerabilities. So I guess one of the ideas is that especially teen girls, they're much more, in terms of their the way they deal relationally, so they're far more likely to be relationally aggressive is a term that's used, whereas guys are more likely to be physically aggressive, right? But so social media just seems to be able to heighten these methods of gossip, rumor, exclusion, inclusion, these kind of things. And so there's just something about it that seems to magnify the vulnerabilities amongst teenagers, especially for girls.
Yeah, and I was talking to sorry, Tavi. Last week, we were talking to, and a couple of these guys watching, I can see were here last week, talking to Ginny Mansberg, and Ginny reminded us about how we would come home from school, back in the day, and now if our peers wanted to reach us, they'd have to do that thing like pick up the phone, not just pick up the phone, but get through the gatekeeper of, "Hi, Mrs. Rowe."
Yeah.
And actually, no, it's past 8 o'clock. And that was the gatekeeper, and our parents had much more of that kind of role, didn't they, in that protectiveness and
well, that's the thing. I think as parents now, I mean, this is one of the challenges where everything might look hunky-dory outwardly, but so much of their world is digital. You do feel, I think you do feel a bit more powerless as a parent to it. I think you have to try a lot harder. You really have to make some extra efforts because they just have whole worlds. I mean, this where on one level, lockdown's been, very difficult for kids. But some of the kids I see prefer it because they're so socially anxious and they don't necessarily want to face school. I mean, many of them have quite enjoyed it. And the other aspect, I mean, the reality is they're such digital natives that they can be very sophisticated in the way they both educate themselves and stay in touch with their friends. But another key point here, Claire, is there is growing evidence that because our kids now are always digitally interacting, and as you say, most of them don't want to talk, like face any sort of direct conversation, is like, whoa, that's like a big deal. Like it's got to be your closest friend in the world to actually talk to them on the phone directly, IRL, in real life. So that seems to be showing that potentially there are some early markers that they're lacking some aspects of empathy, some of the complexities of human relationships that, this is a critical time period where you learn that. So there's some evidence that they may well not entirely grasp that because the types of conversations they're having, the types of learning they're having around non-verbal behavior almost every generation thinks whatever the young people are doing now is just the worst thing ever, right? Every generation has thought that just about. People thought when bikes came on the scene that was going to be a recipe for growth in teen pregnancies, right? Back in the day. I remember reading that. To some extent, some of this may be a moral panic, but there is evidence. There's, that empathy, just conversation. An interesting thing I feel like in many, and you might see this too, Claire, in many of the teenagers you see, that the very notion of small talk. I don't remember chatting about weather and traffic that much as a teenager, but it is a core skill of human interaction. So that's a real declining. That's an endangered species. It's an endangered species of human interaction in the upcoming generations. Because they just don't do it. Because more just got be a text or they've already kind of set up to meet. So this whole thing where the idea that you're just going to run into someone and not know them already or not have interacted online before you see them, that's much less common.
Yeah, that's amazing to think about, actually. And I do know pediatricians in the area who are diagnosing things like autism spectrum disorders for children who have questioned with me whether there is such an influence of their, of their life being a digital native, of not developing those skills. When do we call this a social disorder like autism, and when do we call it a product of I've never actually engaged in small talk because I'm staring at a screen my whole life? So those issues are just, it's just.
Look, Claire, what we're seeing is no question. Look, much of what we're seeing are medicalization of a whole suite of social problems. There's no question, and most of these, that's the challenge of our job, isn't it? Where we see people as individuals, and particularly teens. They're usually products of a family system, but our power is often limited to the individual. We can touch on relationships and family systems a little. So often, the classic is ADHD. I use the analogy that I can't prescribe happy families. I can't prescribe, comfortable schoolyards or this kind of stuff. I can't prescribe, happy marriages, etc. No divorces. What you can give is a little pill, and often it seems to help. And then we call this thing ADHD or something. But that is a lot of the job is that, unfortunately.
Yeah. So last of all, the $1 million question, I suppose, and we've probably kind of covered it, but do teens these days have it harder than previous generations? Is it all relative? Is every generation going to say that they've had it the hardest? The boomers would certainly say, no way, we had it harder. We grew up with nothing after the war. But I certainly think parenting is at its hardest. But maybe that's because I'm a parent of young children and I'm there going, no, my mother didn't have this. What was interesting is if I ask my parents some of these concepts about resiliency and did you worry about our self-esteem growing up? My mother would look at me and go, I don't have time to worry about your self-esteem. Your self-esteem is fine. It was just not concepts that
they would have had in their lexicon back then, would they, Claire?
No, and so she would kind of look at this and go, what are you overanalyzing all that for? It's ridiculous. But the world has changed, and I certainly think parenting is harder. Do teens have it harder now than a generation ago?
Look, every generation, I think, has unique challenges. And I think our kids, they're growing up in the most prosperous, kind of peaceful time in human history, right? So there's this huge material prosperity. But arguably, they're possibly emotionally less nourished than previous generations too. Most households in terms of how outer products, so be it our generations might have been on fatty food or TV, whatever it might be, in terms of things that can co-opt our biology, technology is more powerful. The modern smartphone and its wares is possibly more powerful than most. So if they're less equipped to handle some of that, set limits, control impulses, do it in a healthy way, I think that's the area that it probably is harder for them than most other generations, because the power of the products trying to co-opt our vulnerabilities, it has grown with each generation. It might have been chocolates and a Chico roll and television for us growing up, whereas now it's much more powerful in what can kind of
It was so simple. It was so simple, wasn't it? I just feel like it was so simple. Chico roll and your friend trying to get through your mum on the phone line and sneaking around the corner with the cord so your brother doesn't listen. That was simple. Anyway, now I sound really old and I'm just, those were the days.
Old, Claire. Unfortunately, now we are.
All right. Well, that was a really great chat. That was fantastic. Really, really great, Tanveer. Thank you so much. We'd love to have you back on. And we should talk about maybe more about ADHD next time, because that's a huge one with our clients. And when lockdown's over, we'll catch up and do some small talk.
Yeah.
We'll practice that skill. All right. Thanks very much. See you later. Thanks, Tanveer.